You remember when your father was called when your uncle was killed, right?
Yes.
And what did your dad say?
Well, the day that my uncle was killed, the day my uncle was killed, I was picked up early. I was going to the Sidwell Friends School in Washington, D.C. with two of my siblings, or actually one of my siblings, Joe. We were picked up early from school that day, and as we were leaving school, there were flags in Washington, D.C. were being lowered to half-mast.
Wow.
And I asked my mom, why are they doing that? And she said, a bad man killed Uncle Jack. And when I got home, my father was walking in the yard with John McCone, who was the head of the CIA. My uncle had fired Allen Dulles after the Bay of Pigs, after Dulles lied to him. He actually wanted my father to run the CIA because they thought the CIA was so out of control, and he believed only my father could straighten it out. My grandfather had intervened and said, you can't, the optics for the whole world will be terrible if a president's brother is running the secret police agency. It will be, there's too much temptation to collusion and, but to politicize it.
Right.
And so they brought in John McCone, who was a Republican businessman, and he was a very pious Catholic. And they thought that he would straighten it out. But of course, in the CIA, nobody ever told him what was going on. And Dulles was still running it at that time from a distance. And so anyway, my father, the CIA is only about maybe half a mile from my house. We lived in Langley. So we used to, when the CIA was being constructed, the headquarters, we would ride every day, go horseback riding. My father would wake us up at 6 every morning and take us horseback riding with 9 kids.
Jeez.
And we would go through the CIA property. So I watched it be built. And then when McComb was appointed, he would come to our house every day during the springtime and during the autumn to swim in our swimming pool after work. So he would leave work around 4 or 5, and he would come over and do laps. And our swimming pool was only a couple of minutes away. A lot of times he'd come to lunch at my house. My father was walking with him in the yard, and I didn't know what he said at that time, but it's been reported since that my father said, "Did your people do this?" My father made 3 calls that day. He made the first call he made after J. Edgar Hoover, who told him my uncle had been shot. He called the desk officer at the CIA, and he said the same question, "Did your people do this?" Then the next call he made was to Harry Ruiz, who was one of the Cuban Bay of Pigs. He was one of the Cuban activists. He had fought alongside of Castro, then turned against Castro, and had been part of the Cubans, the militarized Cubans in this country who were part of the Bay of Pigs invasion. He didn't actually go in the Bay of Pigs, but he was part of it. And he was very close to my father and remained loyal to him, even when many of the other Bay of Pigs Cubans had turned against him. And my father called him. He was at a hotel in Washington. And my father said to him, was it your people who did this? His first suspicion, it was the Miami Cubans who were affiliated with the CIA and who were very, very hostile to Jack and my dad. And because they believed that my uncle should have invaded in the Bay of Pigs, should have provided air support and then gone in and deposed Castro. And they felt he was a traitor. Some of them felt that he was a traitor for that. And then in '62, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they wanted him to go in. And he had instead begun a process of détente with Khrushchev and with Castro. In fact, the day that my uncle was killed, he had an emissary meeting with Castro at Castro's summer house at Verdadero Beach in Cuba, outside of Havana, and talking about what the conditions would be to end the embargo to Cuba, which my uncle wanted to do.
Wow.
And so, but, he knew there was tremendous hostility toward him in the Cuban community, among some members of the Cuban community, and that a lot of those people had been working with the CIA on the assassination programs against Castro, and that, a lot of them were highly, highly militarized. They'd been in Batista's army. They were sharpshooters. There was all kinds of, sort of highly militarized people who were capable of doing this.
So I'm watching a show. It's just out on Netflix called The Octopus Murders. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's another really bad period of the CIA, starting in the 1980s under Reagan, and killing, and it's horrible what they were doing.
Mainly like Operation Condor in Latin America, and Sandinistas.
Yes, but it's much deeper than that. It now seems. After the 60s, we had the Church Commission. Then the 80s, we're seeing it again with Iran-Contra. We're seeing it now. Is there a way to bring the CIA, NSA, NSC, all of it under control?
Yeah, I mean, my uncle actually, one of the documents that the CIA has been kept secret, and there's a few thousand documents left, but in the most recent release last year, one of the documents that was released was a memo from Arthur Schlesinger to my uncle that summarized my uncle's plans for reorganizing the CIA, for how to, end this kind of rogue, operation.
Right.
And my father, a week before he died, my father was asked by Pete Hamill, who was a famous New York kind of street reporter, and very close to my father. He was a high school dropout who'd become this, incredible important reporter in New York. And Hamill asked my father, they were on a bus in California campaigning, and Hamill asked him, what are you going to do about the CIA? And my father essentially paraphrased what this earlier memo said, which is that he was going to separate the plans division, which is the dirty tricks division, from the espionage division. And those are the two main functions of the CIA. The espionage is what you want the CIA to be doing. That's information gathering and analysis, analytics. And the president needs that service. He needs to know what's happening around the world, what the ramifications of various decisions will be. And so that is necessary. And that was why the CIA was founded, to do that. But Allen Dulles very early on had changed the function of the CIA to allow it to do, all these other malevolent tasks, which overthrowing governments, fixing elections, bribing public officials, all of the sort of dirty tricks. That's called the plans division. And my father had seen that tail, the plans division tail, was now wagging the espionage dogs, and the espionage division had become the servant to the plans division. And the espionage division's function was to provide tasks for the plans division to fix things in other countries, and then it served the function of justifying those and making sure none of the blowback was ever accounted for or weighed or measured or reported. My father saw that was catastrophic, and that the espionage division was enabling the plans division to do all this stuff and making sure they were never held accountable. My father wanted to break them up into two separate agencies. The espionage division would be looking over the dirty tricks division and saying, okay, what was the blowback? If you ask the CIA, one of the greatest coups in their history, that's not a good word to use because it's not the actual word, but one of the greatest triumphs in their history was overthrowing Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, and then the next one in 1954. they overthrew Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. Guatemala's never recovered. It's got the highest murder rate in the hemisphere. It's, got terrible poverty. It never recovered from that. Iran has never recovered from the overthrow of Mossadegh. The problems we're having in Iran today, and the problems that go to Gaza and Iraq and everything else, all come from that overthrow. We took the first democratically elected president in the 4,000 history of Iran, and who would love the United States, and he loved us. And Churchill tried to overthrow him first, and his advisors said to him, they threw out the British embassy closed, and his advisor said to him, you should throw out the United States too, because they're part of it. And he said, no, the United States would never do that. The United States is a colonial nation, and they stand up for democracy, and they believe in us. And that was when Truman was president. But as soon as Eisenhower came in, and Eisenhower kind of, had this relationship with Dulles, where Dulles became very powerful. And, for good reason. Eisenhower had been the general in World War II. He did not want to go into another war. And he saw the CIA as kind of a way to manipulate public events and to
avoid
get rid of problems
without
sending U.S. troops abroad.
Right.
And so he relied very heavily on Dulles. And Dulles, had this... Dulles was able then to just run amok. And there's a terrific, probably the best book on Dulles is by David Talbot. It's called Devil's Chessboard. It's a fantastic book. But one of the things Talbot says about him is that he was incapable of distinguishing between the corporation, the welfare of the corporations that he had represented. He had been an attorney for Sullivan Cromwell, and which is the biggest white shoe law firm in New York. And his clients had been Texaco, United Fruit Company, and these other companies that were operating. Oh, and Texaco wanted when Mohammed Mossadegh said, hey, we're going to start actually charging BP and Texaco for the oil that they're taking from our country. Dulles said, oh, that means they're communists, and overthrew them. But it was protecting the financial, the mercantile interests of Texaco. Right. And then the same thing happened in Guatemala. Jacobo Arbenz was a democratically one of the greatest leaders in Latin American history. And he said 80% of Guatemala's arable land was controlled by United Fruit. And they weren't using it. They were keeping it fallow to keep the price of labor low and the price of bananas high. And so Jacobo Arbenz said, no, we're going to distribute it all to the peasants. And we're going, including his own land. He nationalized his own property. And he said, we're going to pay them for it. But United Fruit had claimed on its tax returns that all of this property, 80% of the land in the country, was worth only $17 million because they wanted to keep their taxes low.
Right.
But then when he said, okay, we're going to nationalize it, and here's your $17 million, they said, no, we were making a mistake. It's really $300 million. And he said, that's not what you've been saying for 20 years when you were paying tax, and we're going to give you what you said it was worth yourself. And so they, got on the phone to Dulles and had him overthrow the government. Wow. And Guatemala's never been, so the espionage division ought to be looking at these blowbacks and say, okay, Obama, you used a drone and you killed the terrorists and, his kids with that drone attack, and it was a bad terrorist, and we got rid of him. Well, what's the long-term cost?
Correct.
He has 14 brothers. Are they now all going to be calm about it, or are they now jihadists?
Right.
And that kind of blowback is never, ever assessed by the CIA, and that's one of the problems with having those two divisions, melded.